Okay, everyone, thanks so much for being here with our Beginning Again retreat. And we're going to talk about the varying experiences that we might have with grief, depending on what happened as someone in our family or someone that we're friends with has been dying. I started thinking about tragedy as it relates to death because my brother died in August of 2021 suddenly. And then my mom died a year later, exactly on the same day. And the two different deaths and our response to those deaths was very different because my brother's sudden death felt like a tragedy, and my mom's gradual death felt like just a closure, just a natural end to her life. And what I started doing was actually reframing this idea of tragedy, because what had occurred to me was part of the tragedy of my brother's death was it felt like his life had been a tragedy that we couldn't actually comfort him about. And for my mom, her death really happened over a period of a year. Her declines happened over a year, and we were able to keep her home. And that felt like a blessing. So anytime I talk about a particular word, I like to think about, well, what's the definition of the word? What are we really talking about? So here's the definition of a tragedy. It's a disaster, a calamity. It's something dreadful. And I think we can all think about any death that happened during the pandemic as a tragedy. But there are circumstances around death that also, I think, put them in a category of tragedy. So let's think about what could have been tragic for you as you experienced a death. And I'd love for you to share in the chat room any experiences that you've had around someone's death that felt tragic for you. Oops, I'm sorry. So for me, I think about there could be tragic circumstances. And I think certainly we can look to the pandemic where the circumstances when someone died were tragic. It was tragic if you couldn't be there. It was tragic if you were relying on someone else to provide the care that you knew you could do better. You were the best, and yet you couldn't be there. I think sometimes situations can feel tragic, where perhaps you felt like you wanted to be there at the end and you weren't, just for some particularly normal reason. Perhaps you stepped out to take a break, and when your caree, the person who received your care, died, you can feel robbed of those last moments, and that can feel tragic to you. We can have relationships within that death experience that can feel tragic. So, in my experience, we have an older sister who is not well emotionally, who brings a lot of drama, and has been very difficult for us to maintain a relationship with over the years. For my mom, that was one of her life's tragedy, was that her relationship with her oldest child was very fragmented and very occasional. Once in a while, we would see her. And we knew at my mom's end that my oldest sister might pop up, and she did. And it was a relationship that we managed when my mom had gotten so close to death that she was unresponsive. But the tragedy, I think, of that situation is for my other sister and my other brother and my father and myself, we had to manage this disruption. So we weren't able to completely focus on being there and being fully present for my mom because we had to manage my sister's disruption. Ultimately, we invited her to come and see my mom before my mom passed, and she didn't. It was her choice. And that's a tragedy in and of itself. One of the things that I was able to help my mom create was closure around that relationship with my sister. So at the very end, my mom had her anointing of the sick through her priest. We actually came to terms with what does that feel like in terms of the relationship with my older sister, and how do we manage that? And it turned out that my mom was very much at peace about that relationship, and I'm grateful for that. We can also think about a tragedy around the impact of the death. Oftentimes during a caregiving experience, we can feel like our caree is the glue for the family. We show up for each other at family holidays because we think, oh my gosh, this might be mom's last one. And then we start to worry about, well, what does the family look like after a caree's death? How will we stay together? And if it feels like everybody takes a different path away from the center of the family, which could have been your caree, the impact feels tragic. What has happened to us that we can't come together a couple times a year as a family unit and celebrate? Why is it that our family has had a secondary death, another loss, and that is the loss of the family unit because that one person died? And then I think unanswered questions can feel like a tragedy. During Denise's presentation earlier today, I was thinking about one of the questions that really upset me after my brother's death, which was, what did he die from? So people were trying to figure out, how does someone die at 61, right? Because we don't want it to happen to us. And so there's got to be a really good reason that someone dies suddenly. And it made me crazy because I didn't know, I didn't understand it myself. And I felt like I had to give an answer to comfort others when I didn't have an answer that comforted myself. It became very frustrating when people would ask, what did he die of? In our last caring conference, which happened in March, I actually gave a presentation about how can we be a compassionate friend after someone's family member or friend has died. And that's one of the questions I really encourage people not to ask, which is, what did he die from? How did she die? Because the truth is, it's hard to know, right? It's hard to know. And it also brings up, for instance, after my brother's death, because it was sudden and it was at home, the additional tragedy was they had to do an autopsy. His body was with the medical examiner. And as you know, after death, you're always waiting for those death certificates. So my sister-in-law could actually get the body until there was a death certificate because the funeral home couldn't pick up the body. So he was somewhere other than where we wanted him to be for about 10 days after his death. And that question, what did he die from, brought up all those memories about he wasn't where we wanted him to be after he died. So after my mom's death, she was where we wanted her to be. We spent time with her body. We prayed over her body. And then we were able to give her space when the funeral director came and picked up her body so that we didn't have to actually see that. That's another tragedy when there are things that you see after someone's death that you are not prepared to see, like when the body goes into the bag. We might have unanswered questions about who showed up and who didn't. Why couldn't they? Why did they show up in the way that they were? And it could be the support that didn't show up for us after a death. After my brother's death, I had reached out to some friends that I'd been very supportive to and very present in their pain and their difficulties during life. And I felt like they didn't show up for me. So you think, why? Why is it that we show up for others and others don't show up for us? So the tragedy can be around all different circumstances and situations and relationships and impact and our unanswered questions. And I think we're trying to sort through that at a time where we are grieving the loss of an individual in our life. One other unanswered question that I actually had about my brother was, how could I have helped him more? I saw him as someone that was in pain throughout his life. I was younger by 2 years than he was, and I actually did what I could to show up for him throughout his life, trying to figure out how can I alleviate his pain. And what he did was mask his pain with anger. So he was someone that was easily frustrated, easily angry, and of course angry. And that just repelled my ability to support him. And so you do wonder, how could I have been different for him in relationship with him? That's one of our unanswered questions as well. How could I have been different to help or serve or improve or be better for them? And it can feel difficult when when we don't have an answer to that question. I'd love for you to share in the chat room what might be some unanswered questions you have about someone's death, or how someone showed up for you after a family member's death. Yeah, definitely. Denise is sharing in the chat room that anger is fear or sadness's bodyguard. Absolutely. I could see that with my brother. What's interesting is my niece and I have talked about anger as a theme in our family system, because the go-to default emotion oftentimes in my family system is anger. And I also think anger is oftentimes how we grieve as well. So anger could be our default response to grief. Yeah, and Heather is sharing in the chat room. Did they know how much we loved them? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I think, yes, thank you, Heather. So did they know how much we loved them even when we didn't like them? Exactly, right? Because we repeat these memories in our head where we think, oh my gosh, this was a difficult interaction because I really didn't like what was happening. And so I wonder if the love still showed during these difficult interactions. And so we try to go back in time and almost change the past. So as I've been thinking about the differences between my brother's death and my mother's death, I felt like my mother's death was very natural, and I was able to show up for her in a very powerful way. I will tell you that my mom resisted her death up until the last 10 days. And so working with her and through her end of life took patience and compassion and a lot of problem solving. But I felt good about how I did that with her, how I really navigated difficult conversations with her, how I took a pause on those difficult conversations, how we moved through. And then when she accepted that she had reached her end of life, I felt so great about what we did during her last 10 days. We had put together a plan about who she would see and how she would say goodbye. And she was very at peace about this. The week before she died, she woke up that morning, looked at me and said, what's our agenda for today? Because I had scheduled visits for her. It felt very natural. It felt really just comforting. When the hospice nurse would come to see my mom, especially during the last week, my mom would say, how much longer? And the hospice nurse would say, I think it's 2 or 3 more days. And my mom would say, okay, because she was totally on board with death. She was already in heaven in her mind's eye. And she had felt like she had done her life's work. And I would tell her that, Mom, you have done your life's work here on earth. It's time to go to heaven to do your heavenly work. Okay. So with my brother, I felt like I'd let him down, like I hadn't showed up in a way that felt supportive or in a way that could have changed his life. And I felt like if I could change his life, I could have changed his death date. He wouldn't have died at a young age. He would have lived his natural life. Okay. So I think about our grief includes managing the tragedies. And so I have been thinking about, how do I manage this tragedy of my brother's death, which includes my brother's life. And I think what we can do about our tragedies is look to the relief we feel when there's a natural end. And if we have an experience with a natural end, we gain some peace. And what's interesting about natural ends is that it's not just death. If we look at our days, our lives, our weeks, our years, we've had natural ends that we've experienced peace around. So Maureen is sharing in the chat room that for her, it gave her comfort that her brothers weren't alive during her mother's last years and during the pandemic and during the lockdown. They would have been so mad about it that it would have been difficult for them to manage. And Maureen, you are exactly right. It's very difficult to watch our parents grieve the loss of a child. So I talked about the tragedy that my mom had with her oldest child. And then the last year of my mom's life was managing the tragedy of losing another child. It's very difficult. I think about the day that we buried my brother as the worst caregiving day I had had. My parents at the time were 86 and 89 and trying to provide care for them as I was grieving. And as they were grieving was very difficult. And if you remember, the default emotion in my family is anger. My mom was very angry that day, and I was her target. And we figured it out. We got through it. Okay, so thinking about these natural endings that we've already experienced in our life and what peace they can give us can help us reframe how we think about death and its related tragedies. So I'm curious, when you've had something that feels like it ended naturally, what was comforting for you about that? I'd love for you to share in the chat room about that. So for me, that was what was comforting about my mom's natural ending, was that she was totally accepting of it. And because she was accepting of it, we were all able to communicate and talk about and be there for her in a way that was fully about being present to her. We didn't have any denial, which is so helpful because the denial becomes, oh, you'll get better, mom. Oh, it just means that you just need to eat more, mom. We didn't have any of that. I felt that was so comforting. Maureen, that's so hard when you had, to tell your parents that a sibling has died is probably one of the worst conversations to have. And Jolene is sharing in the chat room that knowing she was ready, realizing she was no longer in pain. And Janet is sharing, could celebrate a life well lived. Thank you for that, Janet. I think that's what we want for everyone's death, that it becomes a celebration with memories and stories that we share about this life that was well lived. That's what we want for all of us. This idea that life is stolen from us, that it's not a well-lived life, becomes part of the tragedy. So natural endings, I think, are about the acceptance. We accept that an ending came. And it could be that we feel like, you know what, I was friends with someone and now I'm not, but that feels natural because we've gone our separate ways, but we wish each other's well. We are grateful for the time that we spent together. It's comforting, it's peaceful, it's good memories. It's those natural endings that we're looking for around every death, I think. Yeah, Maureen is sharing in the chat room that when her mom was dying, her mom asked if she was dying. And we talked, and they were able to talk about it in a moment of clarity. Yeah, and I agree with you, Maureen, that it feels good to be honest and to say yes, to be accepting of that, to be truthful about that. There's so much power in the truth. So what I think we're looking for with these tragedies is to think about what can we have in terms of natural connections with those who might have died and whose death feels, for whatever reason, like a tragedy. So I think we can create some natural connections around writing a letter to that family member who has died, writing a poem about them, doing something like taking a walk, and during the walk, just remembering them. Something that was very powerful for me after my brother died was the donations to one of the charities we picked, which was Cubs charity. So my family they are huge Cubs fans, Chicago Cubs. And the charity that the Cubs has supports youth in the city in Chicago, especially girls, to play baseball. My brother was very much a supporter of women going out there and just doing it. And I found so much comfort in knowing that he probably, and I believe that we are energy. So I believe my brother has taken on another shape, another energy. So I believe he goes to watch the girls play baseball in their neighborhoods because of the donations that we were able to give in his honor. Okay, so I also think we can think about what's the shared event that brings us comfort. What did you do together that you enjoyed? How can you continue doing that? What's the special day? Oftentimes I think we go to those days like a birthday or an anniversary, but we have other special days. And it could be a song that you hear or a movie that you watch. We can continue these connections. We can connect via a conversation. And the conversation could be, I miss you, forgive me. I am so glad that you are happy and loved right now. Because I believe that that happens after death. The happiness and love gets bigger or better than we could ever imagine. And so I'm grateful that my brother feels this connection to love and happiness in a way that was just elusive for him during life. And as I thought about my brother, right after the holidays this past year, it occurred to me that I love my brother and his death doesn't stop the love. So as I had just challenged myself around how could I have loved him more or better during his life, I realized that I love him more and better now because I see him in a different way. I see him as doing the best he could in the years that were given him. And so what I found in terms of my answer, when people would say, how did he die? What did he die of? I would just say, he lived until he died. And that brought me peace. So my conversation with my brother is around loving him. I love him. And my conversation with my mom is I am so happy she's in heaven. She wanted to be in heaven so much. I'm so happy she's there. And I know she's happy there. And I know that she is doing heavenly work for those of us on earth. And that also brings me so much calm and peace and happiness. So what's the conversation you can have with your family member? And how can you continue that conversation? And how can you continue to know that the love remains? It doesn't die at death. And sometimes it just grows. So how can you give yourself that opportunity to have love grow? Because we can connect with the love in order to continue to create and share. Because our love creates and shares blessings and abundance and opportunities. And we want that for everybody. So my question that I'll leave with you today is, what's the connection you will create that creates the healing? So it's not a tragedy, but another expression of love. Okay. Thank you all so much. That was so helpful for me, and I hope it was helpful for you. Okay, we're going to take our 9-minute break. So we'll come back at top of the hour and we'll finish up our last hour of our Beginning Again retreat.